The Javeayah Harris case just took a major turn in South Carolina. What first looked like a desperate search for a missing 4-year-old girl has now become something much darker. Police were told Javeayah vanished from her backyard near the family's chicken coop. Helicopters went up, K-9 teams were brought in, hundreds of people searched for her, hoping she was still alive. But investigators now say the story they were given was not the truth. And by the time that 911 call was made, Javeayah may have already been gone for weeks. This is Alex Investigates, and today we're breaking down the heartbreaking South Carolina case of Javeayah Harris, a case that began with a missing child report, but quickly turned into something much more disturbing, because police now believe the search started after it was already too late. That is the contradiction at the center of this case.
Hey,
What you want to say about the baby?
J-Time, baby.
At first, everything looked like a rescue mission. A little girl was missing. A family was scared. A community was asked to help. And when a child is only 4 years old, nobody wants to waste even 1 second. People heard the story and imagined the worst kind of accident. Maybe Javeayah had wandered too far. Maybe she was scared somewhere. Maybe she was hidden in the woods, waiting for somebody to find her. So the search moved fast. In Aiken, South Carolina, near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road, the area around the family's home became the center of attention. There was a backyard, there was a chicken coop, there was a story about a child playing outside and then suddenly disappearing. And from the outside, that story sounded possible enough to act on. Helicopters searched from above. K-9 teams worked the ground, drones scanned the area. Officers, firefighters, volunteers, and search crews moved through the land, hoping they were still inside that small window where a missing child could be found safe. But while the public was focused on the search, investigators had another job too. They had to listen closely. They had to compare the timeline. They had to ask whether the story matched the evidence. Because a missing child case does not only depend on emotion, it depends on details. Where was she last seen? Who saw her? What time did it happen? Who called for help? And does every part of that story line up? That is where this case began to shift. The search still looked like a rescue. But behind the scenes, police were starting to question whether they were searching for the right reason, at the right time, based on the right story. So the question becomes simple, but painful. How does a missing child search become something much darker? But here is where everything changes. The story police were first given was not the story investigators say the evidence later supported. The first report mattered because it shaped everything that happened next. When police were first called, they were told Javeayah had vanished from the backyard near the family's chicken coop. And at first, that sounds like the kind of detail that gives search crews a starting point. A child outside, a backyard, a rural area, a chicken coop nearby, a family saying she was there one moment and then she was gone. So if you are a dispatcher hearing that call, you do not have the luxury of waiting around. You have to move fast. You have to treat it like every second matters, because in a real missing child case, it does. Officers do not start with the full truth. They start with what they are told. And what they were told pointed them toward the home, the yard, and the land around it. So the first response followed that story. Search the backyard, search the nearby woods, search around the chicken coop, search anywhere a small child could have walked, hidden, fallen asleep, or gotten confused. Think about it from the outside. If you heard a 4-year-old girl went missing from her backyard, what would you picture? Maybe she followed an animal. Maybe she wandered too far. Maybe she got scared and hid somewhere. Maybe she was close by, but too small to be seen in the dark or in the brush. That is the fear that pushed everyone into action. And that is why the backyard story became so important, because the first version of any case can control the first few hours. It decides where officers search, it decides what neighbors are told, it decides where volunteers look, it decides what the public believes happened. But according to authorities, that first version did not hold up. Investigators later said the story they were given was not the truth. Police now believe Javeayah did not simply vanish from the backyard that evening. They believe the timeline was much older than the 911 call made it seem. And that changes everything, because if the timeline was wrong, Then the search area was built around a story investigators no longer believe. The urgency was real. The fear was real. The people searching were real. But the reason they were searching that way may not have been. That is what makes this case so heavy. A 911 call can bring help, it can bring hope, it can bring an entire community together. But if the information behind that call is not true, then every step after it moves in the wrong direction. The first story created one kind of search, but the evidence was about to create a very different kind of case.
All right, besides you, how many of us live in the household with you?
Just me, my girlfriend, and my child.
Okay, does she contribute to the financial status of the house as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Then the search grew bigger. It was no longer just a few officers walking around a yard. It became a full effort across Aiken County, with one goal in mind: find Javeayah. Helicopters went overhead, drones scanned the land from above, K9 teams moved through brush, fields, and wooded areas. Firefighters came in, emergency crews came in. Local law enforcement, state investigators, federal support, and volunteers all joined the search for one little girl. Every place mattered: a shed, a ditch, a backyard, a patch of woods, a small space where a 4-year-old might hide if she was scared. Nobody wanted to miss anything. Nobody wanted to be the person who walked past the one place where she could have been. And that is what made the search feel so urgent. Because at that stage, people were still acting on hope. They believed there was still a chance. They believed Javeayah might be somewhere nearby. Maybe tired, maybe afraid, maybe waiting for someone to call her name. So they kept looking. Hundreds of people searched because that is what a community does when a child is missing. You do not sit back and wait. You show up. You walk the land. You check your property. You listen for updates. You pray the next call is the one that says she has been found safe. From the outside, it looked like an intense rescue effort, and in many ways it was. But inside the investigation, something else was happening too. Police were not only searching the ground, they were searching the story. They had to ask hard questions. Did the timeline make sense? Did the backyard detail match the evidence? When was Javeayah last truly seen? Who was around her? And why were there no clear answers after so many people had searched so much land? Then the days started passing. No confirmed sign of Javeayah, no safe return, no simple explanation. And when a search that large finds nothing, investigators have to look at the case differently. Not because hope disappears right away, but because the facts start demanding attention. That is when the focus slowly began moving closer to the people connected to the first report. Because what happens when a search does not find the child, but starts exposing problems in the timeline? That is the question this case was moving toward. And the longer the search went on, the more one painful possibility started moving closer to the center of the case. Then came the announcement that changed everything. It was July 4th. While many people were focused on the holiday, officials in Aiken County were preparing to tell the public something no one wanted to hear. This was no longer just a missing child search. Authorities said they believed Javeayah was no longer alive. And as painful as that was, the timeline made it even harder to understand. Because investigators did not just say they believed something had happened to her, they said evidence suggested Javeayah may have been gone for at least a month before the 911 call was ever made. Let that sit for a second. Javeayah was reported missing on June 30th. The story first given to police made it sound like she had just vanished from the backyard near the chicken coop. That was the story that sent helicopters into the sky. That was the story that brought K9 teams, drones, emergency crews, and volunteers into the search. That was the story that made people believe there was still time. But now investigators were saying the timeline may have started weeks earlier. And that is the detail that turns this case in a completely different direction. Because if investigators are right, the search was not just late. It may have been built around a version of events that delayed the truth. Think about what that means. Hundreds of people were out there searching with urgency. They were walking through land, checking areas, following leads, and hoping Javeayah was somewhere waiting to be found. The community was acting on hope. The responders were acting on the information they had. The public was watching a rescue effort. But behind the scenes, the case was shifting into something heavier. Investigators were no longer only asking where Javeayah went. They were asking when she was last truly okay. They were asking who knew what. They were asking why the report came when it did. And they were asking whether the story told on June 30th matched the evidence they were finding. That is what made the July 4 announcement so heartbreaking. It did not just remove hope from the search. It raised a new and darker question about the days and weeks before the call. Because if Javeayah had already been gone for weeks, then the most important part of the case was not the moment police were called. It was everything that happened before that call. That meant the case was no longer only about where Javeayah was, it became about what happened before anyone called for help. At the center of the case were the two people closest to Javeayah, her parents, Javeayah Harris, 23, and Michelle Herring, 22. And that is part of what made this case feel so painful for the public, because this was not a story about a stranger taking a child from a yard. This was not the kind of case where police were searching for some unknown person hiding in the shadows. The attention turned back to the home, back to the people who made the report. Back to the adults who were supposed to know where Javeayah was, who she was with, and when she was last okay. After investigators announced the case had changed direction, both parents were arrested. They were charged with homicide by child abuse, and Michelle Herring also faced an additional charge connected to the police report. Now, it is important to say this clearly. These are charges. These are allegations, and every part of the case still has to go through the court process. But from the investigators' side, the argument is serious. Authorities believe the parents knew more than they first reported. Investigators believe that the missing child story did not match what had already happened. And according to arrest warrants, the parents reportedly made statements about their roles in the case. Still, even a reported statement has to be tested. The court has to look at what was said, how it was said, when it was said, and what other evidence supports it. But this is why the case hit so hard, because the public was not just hearing that two people had been charged. They were hearing that the two people charged were the adults closest to Javeayah. The same home where the missing report began became the center of the investigation. The same backyard story that sent search teams into motion became the story investigators now say was not supported by the evidence. And for many people watching, that is the part they cannot get past. A 4-year-old child was reported missing. A community searched for her, and then police said the truth may have been hidden long before the first call for help. That is the investigators' side of the case. They believe the timeline matters. They believe the first report matters. They believe what happened before June 30th is the key to understanding everything after it. But even when a case feels emotionally clear to the public, the courtroom asks a colder question. What can be proven? The biggest question in this case is not only what happened on June 30th, it is what happened before June 30. Because once investigators said Javeayah may have already been gone for weeks, the case changed from a search around one evening to a timeline that had to be rebuilt piece by piece. And that is not simple. Now investigators have to move backward. They have to look at the days before the 911 call, then the week before, then the weeks before that. They have to ask when Javeayah was last truly seen by someone outside the home. Not just talked about, not just mentioned, actually seen. Who saw her? Where was she? What condition was she in? When did people outside the family last know she was okay? Those questions matter because a missing month does not explain itself. Somebody has to account for that time. And this is where the investigation starts to look like a board covered in dates, names, phone records, statements, search areas, and unanswered questions. One side has the 911 call on June 30. Another side has investigators saying the evidence points further back. And in between those 2 points, there is a gap. That gap is what police now have to understand. They have to review phone records. They have to compare statements. They have to speak with relatives, neighbors, anyone who may have had contact with the family. They have to check where the parents may have gone, who they spoke to, and whether anything connects to places outside Aiken County. Every small detail can matter. A message, a missed visit, a strange explanation, a person who thought something felt off but did not know what it meant at the time. But here is the hard part. Investigators cannot fill that gap with emotion. They have to fill it with proof, because the central question is still the same. What does the evidence actually prove about the time between the last confirmed sign of Javeayah and the 911 call? That is the part that makes this case so unsettling. A missing month, a changed story, a search that moved beyond the first location, a community waiting for answers, and a little girl whose final known timeline is still being pieced together from what people said, what records show, and what investigators can confirm. So, no, this case is not only about the night police were called, it is about the silence before that night. Because in this case, the most important part of the story may not be the day police were called, it may be the days no one was calling. But then the other side asked everyone to look closer. Not because the case is not painful, not because Javeayah's life does not matter, and not because the public is wrong to feel heartbroken by what investigators have said, but because in court, emotion is not enough. Charges are not the same thing as proof. Allegations are not the same thing as a verdict. And even when a case feels clear to people watching from the outside, prosecutors still have to walk into a courtroom and prove every part of it, step by step. That is where the defense side lens comes in. The other side may ask the jury to slow down and look at the evidence without rushing to the ending. They may argue that a reported confession still has to be examined carefully. What exactly was said? When was it said? Was it complete? Was it recorded clearly? Was there pressure? Did both parents say the same thing, or were their statements different? Those questions matter, because a statement is not just about the words, it is also about the setting around those words. Then there is the timeline. Investigators believe Javeayah had already been gone for weeks before the 911 call was made. That is a powerful part of the case. But the courtroom may ask, what physical evidence supports that timeline? Can prosecutors prove the exact date? Can they show what happened before June 30th without guessing? Can they prove who knew what and when? And maybe the biggest question is this: can prosecutors prove each parent's role separately? Because two people can be charged in the same case, but the evidence against each person still has to stand on its own. The court has to look at what each person allegedly did, what each person allegedly knew, and what the evidence can actually support. That does not erase the pain of the case. It does not make the search less heartbreaking. It does not change the fact that a 4-year-old girl is at the center of all of this. But it does remind us that public emotion and courtroom proof are not the same thing. The public wants answers fast. The courtroom requires proof step by step, and that is the legal tension in this case. Everyone wants to understand how the first story fell apart. Everyone wants to know what happened before the 911 call. Everyone wants accountability if the evidence supports it. But the law still asks the same cold question: what can be proven? And that is why this case cannot be closed only by anger. It has to be carried by evidence. By this point, the search had changed. At first, everyone was moving with one hope in mind: find Javeayah alive and bring her home safely. That was the reason helicopters went up. That was the reason K-9 teams were brought in. That was the reason volunteers walked through land, checked yards, looked near homes, and searched places most people would normally never think twice about. They were not doing it for attention. They were not doing it because they had all the answers. They were doing it because a 4-year-old child was missing. And when a child is missing, people show up. That matters. Because even now, with investigators saying the first story was not the truth, the people who searched were not wrong for hoping. The responders were not wrong for moving fast. The community was not wrong for believing there might still be time. They acted on the information they had. They acted on hope. But now, that same search carries a different meaning, because police no longer see this only as a rescue effort. Authorities are now focused on recovery, answers, and building a case that can stand in court. That is a completely different kind of search. It is slower, heavier, more painful. Now, investigators are not just asking where a missing child may have walked. They are asking where evidence may lead. They are looking at areas connected to the investigation. They are following leads beyond the first neighborhood. They are trying to bring Javeayah home with dignity and give the case the answers it still does not have. And think about what that means for the people who were out there searching. They walked through land believing they were looking for a little girl who may have been scared, tired, or waiting to be found. But investigators now believe they may have been stepping into a timeline that had already been hidden. That is a hard thing to sit with for the community, for the search crews, for the family members beyond the accused parents, and most of all, for Javeayah. Because behind every charge, every press conference, every search area, and every unanswered question, there is still a little girl whose life mattered before this case ever became public. She deserves to be more than the timeline, more than the 911 call, more than the story investigators say fell apart. She deserves to be brought home. And until Javeayah is found, one part of the case remains painfully unfinished. The Javeayah Harris case started with one call, a 911 call, a backyard story, a little girl said to have vanished near a chicken coop. And from that first report, everything moved quickly. Search crews came in, helicopters went up, K-9 teams worked the ground, volunteers walked through land, checked spaces, and held on to the hope that Javeayah could still be found safe. That was the story the public first understood. A missing child, a desperate search, a community trying to help. But then the timeline changed. And once investigators said Javeayah may have already been gone for weeks before the call was made, the whole case became something else. Now, the question was no longer just where she was. It became what happened before June 30. When was Javeayah last truly seen? Who outside the home knew she was okay? Why was the report made when it was made? What evidence led investigators to believe the timeline stretched back much further than the first story suggested? And what will the court decide about each parent's role? Those questions still matter because this case is not only about shock, it is not only about anger, and it is not only about the moment police were called. It is about a 4-year-old girl whose life mattered before her name became part of a public investigation. Javeayah was not just a headline, she was a child, and that is the part that should stay at the center of this story. Because when cases like this happen, people naturally want answers right away. They want someone held responsible, they want the full truth, they want to understand how a search that looked like a rescue could turn into something so much heavier. But the court process moves differently. It has to test the timeline. It has to test the statements. It has to test the evidence. It has to decide what can be proven, not just what people believe happened. If investigators are right, this was not just a missing child report. It was a story that sent hundreds of people searching for a child they may never have had a chance to save. And that is a hard thought to sit with, but the courtroom still has to answer the hard part. What does the evidence prove, and who can be held responsible under the law? Do you think the timeline is the strongest evidence in this case, or do prosecutors still need something more to prove exactly what happened? Drop your thoughts below.